Hi guys, this is Katie at Homo Libriensis. I thought today that I would do a video about my favorite books. So just kind of favorite books of all time. Not exactly favorite books of all time because if you ask me on any given day, I would probably answer you differently, but these tend to be the most consistently my favorite. A few of them I've only read once a long time ago, and I guess I still consider them favorites because of how much I think about them and how emotionally impacted I was from that book, and I actually might not reread them just because I'm not sure that they would necessarily hold up, but I'll try to point those ones out. So I don't even know how many are on the list, probably about 10. These are definitely in no particular order, just the order that I wrote them down on my spreadsheet. So this one, Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. I am obsessed with nonfiction. I love it. And I tend to reread nonfiction more than I read or reread fiction. So this book is, I've read this one at least 3 times, if not more. So this one is, the author's Jon Krakauer. He's a journalist, and he decided to document an ascent to Everest and document the other teams that were ascending Everest in 1996. And he happened to be there for one of the worst years on record in terms of deaths on the mountain. And so he tells it from his perspective. He does an incredible job. It's one of the best books I've ever read. I mean, he writes it like a journalist. It's gripping and fast-paced, and he provides a lot of detail. And it's so intense, and even though I already know more or less, I know what happens, I can read it, maybe once a year. It's such a good book. So that one. This one. So this one I've never seen anyone talk about anywhere. I don't think it's a very popular book. It's called Spoken Here by Mark Abley, and I was, in my second year, I think, of university, and I was at the bookstore, and I saw this on the sale table for, I think, $6. This is not the original copy. I've lent it out so many times, and I don't think anybody's actually read it, but I've tried to get people to read it. So this journalist becomes interested in languages, and specifically languages that are endangered, languages that may be going extinct, and he starts looking into languages all over the world that are struggling. And so he kind of profiles a whole bunch of different languages in different chapters. So sometimes I'll just grab the book and flip through it and pick a language. And so the first few chapters, I think, are languages that are in danger and may only have anywhere from 1 to a few thousand speakers left. And then later he talks about languages that are being revitalized and that they've found ways of encouraging people to use the language and to have children learning it. So, I'm not really a tea drinker. But yeah, so some of the wonderful stuff in this book, I love it so much. It's just the profiles of languages that we don't hear very often, or maybe, this book was published in 2003, so some of these languages may already be extinct. One language I definitely remember is called Yuchi. It's a language spoken in the United States prior to white settlers arriving, and it survived until this point, but there were fewer than 10 fluent speakers at the time that he wrote this book, and all of them were quite elderly, and he was going over some of the kind of wonderful things about the language. So one of the really interesting things was that the speakers have 2 different forms of the language depending on who's speaking. So if a man is speaking the language, it will have different forms than if a woman is speaking the language. Another thing he talked about was how a lot of languages don't have words for color necessarily. So a language, if they don't have any color words, will just use kind of a dark and a light term. And then consistently all over the world, the next color to be added is red. So if they don't have color, as many color words as we do, but they do have a color after dark and light, they'll add red. And so it's just fascinating to see that even though languages develop kind of so differently, they'll also have a lot of kind of consistencies across the board. Anyway, that is my nerd book that I absolutely love and I recommend checking out, but I haven't, whoa, I just burped. I recommend that you check it out. The next book is Born to Run by Christopher McDougall. Now, I don't have a copy of this. I thought I did, so I don't know. Maybe I lent it out to someone. This one is definitely not for everyone. It's another journalistic book. I think we have a trend, but it's another journalistic book where someone picks kind of a topic and just dives as deeply into it as they possibly can, or as they can. And so he takes the topic of running and he looks at it from all different angles. So he talks to people who are currently doing, or were, I think this was published in maybe 2009, 2010. So he talks to people who were kind of cutting edge scientists about running at that time and theories about human evolution and running. And then he looked at cultures that use running as part of their culture and run like really long distances. And one of my absolute favorite parts was they talk about huge ultra marathons. I forget what it's called, but there's one in Colorado that's 100 miles long. There's probably more than one, but that's known for being especially brutal. And it's just kind of about the people who do these races and the race itself. And I've never run more than a half marathon, and I have no interest in running more than a half marathon. So but there's something about the people who run these and have that sort of mental power, and to do that, I just find them fascinating. So I like reading about those people. So I absolutely love that book. Another one I don't have a copy of. So this is probably the newest one that I've added to the list. It's Men We Reaped by Jessamine Ward. And I've only read this once. I read it fairly recently in the last 6 months. If you're not familiar with this book, Jessamine Ward writes about a period in her life where I think a 5-year period, where 5 young men in her life died under tragic circumstances. And she also gives her own life history, so she kind of tells it in an interesting way where she has her own life kind of progressing chronologically forward, and she has the deaths of the young men progressing chronologically backward, and kind of meeting in the middle at the death of her brother, which was especially tragic in her life. And she takes these tragedies and tells us how they relate to poverty and race. And it is, I think I'll say this a lot during this video, but a heartbreaking book. And her writing is absolutely beautiful. She just has such beautiful imagery. I believe it takes place in Mississippi, and somewhat rural Mississippi, and just her language around that, it feels very, I don't know, it has this strong sense of place where you just feel like you're there. It was a beautiful book, and I definitely need to read something else or anything else that Jessamine Ward has written. This one I don't have a copy of because I read it obsessively. I've read it 3 or 4 times, and I lend it out to people from work. So the book is Brain on Fire by Susanna Cahalan. And this came out, I think, in 12 maybe a little bit, yeah, about 2012, 2013. And it is another journalist, a book written by a journalist, a memoir. It's written by this woman who, in her 20s, she started to come down with this sort of mysterious illness. First, they thought that she was just ill, had a cold, had the flu, and then she started developing these crippling psychiatric symptoms, and she was just diagnosed with a psychiatric illness. And it's her journey of being diagnosed actually with a neurological cause, and this sort of new illness, not a new illness, but a new diagnosis. Very few people were being diagnosed with it, and how ultimately she went through a recovery and was able to write this book. And she does a lot of investigating in order to write the book, because she lost a lot of her memory around this time and was not able to use her memory as a source at all times. She had to look at her journals and videos of her in the hospital and things like that. So like I said, I pass this around at work. I work in a neurology department, so I work with people who've had any number of neurological disorders, brain injuries, strokes, and people with the disorder that Susanna had. And it was just fascinating because after I read this book, it just so happened that this was gaining traction in the neurological community, and the doctors were starting to also know about it and to test people for this. And there definitely have been a few people a year diagnosed with the same illness. And so it's just a fascinating read. So the next one is La Prisonnière, or the other title that it's goes by is Stolen Lives, 20 Years at a Desert Jail. But all of this takes place, I believe, in the 70s or 80s, or starts in the 70s. Yeah, so she is a Moroccan woman. She grows up in Morocco in a place of privilege in the 60s and 70s. And her father is a very powerful man. I think he's a general in the Moroccan army. And when she's older, in her teens or early 20s, he is involved in a coup that is unsuccessful, and so he is executed. And the book is by Malika Oufkir. So Malika and her mother and I think 4 siblings are all captured and placed in jail, and they're held there for 20 years, as it says in the title, and the conditions that they're held in just become gradually worse and worse. And I've probably read this book 3 times, maybe 4, because it's the absolute best and most incredible story about resilience that I've ever read. Definitely physical resilience, because sometimes the conditions that they're held in are physically very awful, but also primarily mental resilience. They're held in this captivity, often in isolation or only with themselves for days, months, maybe even years at a time. And they have to survive, and they have to entertain themselves. And it's what they do to stay close, to stay in contact, to stay sane. And it's just absolutely, I'm going to say this about every book, it's absolutely incredible. And then the last book is this one right here. Can't really see it in the glare. The World Without Us by Alan Weisman. And this one I've read twice, I think, and yet another nonfiction book. Maybe not by a journalist this time, I can't remember. But basically it asks the question, what happens when humans disappear from the earth? So it takes the premise that humans disappear. It looks at what would happen to the earth and to the things that we have built in the hours, days, months, years, and millennia after humans are gone. And basically it looks at what kind of mark are we actually leaving? What are the good things? What are the bad things? What actually won't last very long? What will be very quickly destroyed sort of by the forces of the earth? And it's just kind of a beautiful book about the world that we're in and kind of how precarious our position here, even though we feel very powerful, kind of how precarious our position is here, and the things that we have built and the things that we find value in. So I really recommend that book too. To hear from you. I'd love to hear what your favorite books are. I'd love to hear, to see if you have a favorite books video. I'd love if you linked it for me so I can watch it. And I'd love to hear if you have a favorite nonfiction book, what that is, or if you've read any of these, because especially Spoken Here by Mark Abley, because I've never met anybody else who has read that book, and I would love to talk to someone who has. So that's it, guys. Thanks for checking in.